Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Fronteras, a Changing America. I'm your host, Anthony Moreno. Today we discuss issues facing immigrants, asylum seekers, and issues with social justice in our state. Joining us for the discussion is Adriel Orozco, Executive Director for the New Mexico Immigrant Law Center. For over a decade, the nonprofit organization has had a mission of seeking justice and equity for low-income immigrant communities. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Orozco. I'd like to start off and talk about immigration. Of course, I want to talk about how COVID-19 has impacted that issue in our country as well. But first, I'd like to hear from you. We have nearly 45 million immigrants in our country. Obviously, they make up a substantial part of our workforce in the United States. Immigration has been a major topic in the election among many topics we're dealing with. President Trump obviously has implemented hundreds of executive orders that have changed immigration policy in our country. Vice President Joe Biden says if he's elected, he will roll back the president's changes and go back to an Obama-era immigration system. But how difficult would that actually be in today's legal environment? What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, well, thanks, Anthony, for having me on your show and able to talk about this issue, especially as it impacts our state. I think the difficulty that we've seen in our state is that we have had an increase of detention centers here. We didn't have any specifically for immigration detention starting in October of 2016. That's when we got our first one. And under the Trump administration, we've had two more. With the capacity of having about 2,200 immigrants who can be detained in our state. And so we've definitely seen, even under the Obama administration, an increase in immigrant detention and deportation. And so in our state, we've seen the expansion of that into the Trump administration. And so one of the things that we would definitely want to push for under a Biden administration, if Vice President Biden is able to win the election, would be to curtailing that and pushing back our state's complicity in supporting those types of policies, because these detention centers only exist because counties in our state are contracting out with the federal government to house immigrants in our communities. And so that's one of the things I think that would be the hardest, is really trying to push back that growth of the immigrant detention system that we've seen at the end of the Obama administration and under the Trump administration. There are many other programs that have been negatively impacted by the Trump administration. We've seen DACA. We've seen programs for survivors of crimes and of trafficking. Those types of cases are taking longer. There's really a dysfunction at USCIS, which is the service agency that processes the benefits, which is just really taking longer in processing cases. They're rejecting cases really without giving enough information as to why they're rejecting them, making our jobs a lot harder and taking a lot more time. And then not to mention in immigration court systems, the prosecutorial discretion that was afforded to the prosecutors, to the federal government, was taken away under the Trump administration. And so those cases are really a lot harder to win. And these are cases that people should have the right to fight and could otherwise win. But the Trump administration has really worked to take away discretion away from immigration judges. They proposed several regulations this year to push back against the Board of Immigration Appeals process so that it makes it swifter and faster. And so I think it's going to take some time to try to figure out what could happen, because currently I believe that there are 1 million cases before the immigration court system. And so some of my cases have been pending for 3 or 4 years without any action, just because of the dysfunction that this federal government has created around the immigration court system.
Now, I want to talk with you about some of that right now. Obviously, there's been a lot of reporting on just how overwhelmed our immigration courts are in the United States and how they have been for a long time. So how do you think this issue can be addressed at the federal level to make sure that judges aren't overwhelmed like they were, and that a fair and legal process is in place for people who are seeking to stay in the United States or seek legal status?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question, and it's kind of interesting that we're having this conversation today on September 30th, because in 1996, the Illegal Immigration and Immigrant Responsibility Act was passed. And that act actually was creating a lot of the problems and issues that we're having today. Before 1996, a lot of immigration judges had the discretion to be able to make decisions as to the impact on the immigrant and the immigrant's family and being able to stay in the United States. It also made it a lot harder for immigrants to stay in the United States. It criminalized a lot of actions that immigrants would take that would prevent them from being able to stay in the United States. So we have a legacy of that act actually impacting us till today. And so I think what we need to make sure and look at is how are these legacy laws really impacting negatively our systems? And we need to figure out how is it that we're centering human rights in these processes. I will say that I've been in a courtroom where the judge themselves had been an ICE attorney and opposing counsel who was a current ICE attorney. Both of them were questioning my client. And there's sometimes a lack of a semblance of due process in those cases. And so I know that the American Immigration Lawyers Association and others have pushed to get the immigration courts to be an Article I court. Currently, they're administrative courts. There's very little due process. In order for individuals to have to be able to appeal their cases, they have to get an attorney, or at least the process is a little bit complicated. So having an attorney really makes it so that they do have access to judicial courts. And so I think that there's really a larger reform that needs to take place in order to make sure that individuals actually do have due process rights when they're before an immigration judge and trying to stay in the United States.
Now you mentioned that the judge was in the case that you talked about was an ICE agent. Is that formally, or is that
a former ICE attorney?
Okay, I just wanted to clarify that. Now I want to move on and talk about detention. You talked about immigrant detention, and obviously there's been some criticism on housing immigrants in detention facilities in our state. I'd like to hear from you, what are alternatives to this? I mean, there are some who say, well, unauthorized immigrants broke our law. What are the alternatives to detention?
Right. I think a couple of things first to help in framing the conversation. One is, I've had clients who I've spoken with who, had to go through several countries to get to the U.S.-Mexico border. And when they got to the U.S.-Mexico border, by then they had been assaulted, they had been robbed, and they were really just sort of at wit's end when they got to the border. And so I've heard many stories where they just crossed well, first of all, there isn't necessarily a specific crossing in certain places, but they just saw an officer and they went up to them and turned themselves into Border Patrol. So it's not as if there's this clear line where folks see and then they're willfully violating this law. They're really trying to find some semblance of protection. And that's a certain population, right, that are trying to get protection. But the other thing to think about is that this is civil detention. Really, the reason why this was created was to ensure that individuals went to their court hearing. They're not being punished, at least technically, they're not supposed to be being punished. This is really just a temporary measure while they go through the immigration process. And so I think it's important for us to understand that even though the federal government, under many administrations, has tried to criminalize the immigrant community, this isn't about crime. This is just simply folks waiting to get their fair day in court.
Right.
And so when we think about...
But alternatives, I'd like to get to alternatives. What are the alternatives to detention?
Right, and so there are community programs where you've seen really high rates of compliance, where you have an agent that checks in with somebody to make sure that they know where they're at, that they know where their court hearing is. But to be honest, for most of the clients that I've spoken to, like when people come to the United States to get protection, they want to do what they have to do so that they can get their status. And so I think that this narrative that the federal government has painted that, oh, people come into the United States and they try to flee and then hide is not true. And I think that we have to just sort of understand that once a person gets a court hearing, once they get an attorney, they will usually see that process through. And I think that the rates of going to court are really, really high. They're like in the high 80s or in the 90s. And so I think it's just important for us to like make sure that we're understanding that this narrative that folks are just hiding and not going to continue with their court process is not true. And there's not a need to detain people indefinitely for this reason. And now, I think, and I'm sorry, I'm just going to add another point, is that at the height of last year, there were 50,000 people who were being detained by ICE. Now there are about 20,000 due to COVID. And that undercuts the government's reasoning that it's necessary. It's not necessary to detain immigrants in these prisons. And in fact, we believe that they should all be abolished. We should not have a detention system for immigrants, at least to hold them in perpetuity.
Okay, now you brought up COVID. I'd like to talk about that. Now, can we just discuss how COVID-19 and this pandemic has impacted immigration? Now, you brought up a point there, but what other areas have we seen the pandemic play a role in the current immigration policy, and how do you feel like it's affecting it?
Yeah, well, that's kind of a it's a very broad question, Anthony. And so we can talk about it in the detention context, where beginning in March, we joined the ACLU of New Mexico and other groups to really push the governor of New Mexico to take a stand against the neglectful practices of ICE at our state's 3 immigrant prisons, because we knew that there were going to be outbreaks, and there were. Otero County was really hard hit with more than 800 cases amongst the processing center and the prison facility there. Cibola as well suddenly had 250 cases. And then Torrance County also had more than 50 cases in an outbreak. And so we knew that that was gonna happen. We've gotten calls from individuals who were not getting information. In Otero County specifically, they were being quote unquote quarantined, but they were being put in these cohorts where one individual or a few individuals were thought to have COVID but not tested. And they were told they had to be there for 14 days, but then they kept on adding new people to that cohort. And so people were, for individuals detained, they didn't know what was happening, how long they were gonna have to be there. And then we saw this really mismanagement. And so the detention system really has shown why we can't really trust the federal government in the way that they're operating these detention facilities.
Now, legally though, I mean, what does the state have as options though to address this issue? Because we're talking about a federal issue. So can you kind of share with us, with this pandemic, I mean, how limited are the state's powers when trying to address this issue?
Right, and I think that the state has, they obviously cannot tell the federal government to stop detaining individuals, but the state has several different options, right? One, the governor can come out just with a statement to say that ICE needs to release these individuals because they're putting the rest of our lives at risk, right? I think having a strong voice from the governor would have been really impactful at the beginning. Additionally, each one of these facilities only exists because the counties contract out with the federal government to house detainees, and then the county then contracts out with the private company to operate these prison facilities. Each of these counties could act to get out of those contracts. They could decide to start the process to terminate them, which in most contracts, there's a clause where you can terminate within 90 days, knowing that I believe that Secretary Kunkel, Secretary of Health Kunkel, was trying to contact the federal government to try to provide testing, to try to provide communication, to make sure that our communities were safe, but the federal government wasn't responding. And so when you have an unresponsive federal government, then you have leaders in our counties who can then act. And I think that the state working with the counties to try to figure out a process for that is something that is definitely viable. And I think that it just takes leadership. And I think it just takes understanding that we can't really rely on this federal government to think about the health of our communities.
Now, I want to kind of stay with the asylum issue that you touched on a little bit. Obviously, last year we saw many folks in large numbers come to our southern border hoping to claim asylum. And that issue has been gathered national news. In some cases, we saw cases where there were large numbers of people housed in detention centers or makeshift detention centers. We saw people housed under a bridge in El Paso for a while when the weather was obviously very, very cold and difficult conditions for anybody. With this issue, how do you think this is going to play a role in the future of our asylum process in the United States? Legally, there's so many challenges up against this, but I'm just kind of curious, like, what are the conversations we're not having about this issue? Because when we see the national media and these stories, we see people under bridges or behind bars or kids in cages, but I mean, legally, what are some things that we need to think about when we're talking about this issue?
Yeah, I think we need to think about, just the breadth of our asylum laws and what is it that we really want to focus on as a nation. Our asylum laws have origins from the Geneva Conventions, and they don't even include sex as a potential protected class. And we know that under the federal government, there's attempts to really restrict people's ability to claim asylum based on gender-based violence, what the government thought was just domestic violence in a very narrow context. And we understand that there's still a lot of gender-based violence across the world. And so I think we need to really look at why folks are coming to our border and how is it that we can really expand the laws in a way where we're trying to provide protection. One of the most interesting things to me is that the federal government provides funding for prosecutors to try to prevent people from being able to rightfully claim asylum or to get a benefit in the country through the immigration court system. But there's no federal program to provide an attorney to defend them, to be able to go through that process. And especially knowing that there's so many people that don't know anything about the United States. They have this image of us being as a beacon of hope, as a place of protection. I talked to a Cuban asylum seeker who's held at Torrance County Detention Facility who said, I fled Cuba because I was afraid that I was going to be detained by the government. And then I came here and I was just put behind bars as soon as I crossed the border. And so I think really just reflecting on our values and thinking about, how is it that we really want to make sure that we're supporting human rights and protection? And I think people get really scared thinking that, suddenly there's going to be all these folks in our country and we're going to be overwhelmed. And I think that that's really not the case. I think that in the 1990s, we had really high rates of immigration. And it's not suddenly that the fabric of this country changed. And in fact, I think it has changed in a lot of xenophobic ways, but it hasn't really changed in a very broad, more sympathetic way towards thinking about, why are folks presenting themselves at our border?
Yeah, there's research on that. I mean, Pew has done some research on that, on the number of unauthorized immigrants. That number's actually gone down. It dropped during the Great Recession, over a decade ago. So I want to, or began to drop. But I want to move on and talk about another issue with immigration, and that's the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. It's a program that has impacted the lives of hundreds of thousands of people living in the United States. It has allowed them to have temporary legal status and go to school, be in the military, buy homes, and work legally in the United States. With the uncertainty of that program, what are your concerns on how that could affect our state in general and the country if hundreds of thousands of people can no longer have legal status here? Should that program be eliminated?
Oh, it definitely should not be eliminated. But I think advocates, when they pushed for deferred action for childhood arrivals, knew that that program itself wasn't the end goal, right? And I think what has been helpful with DACA is that we have seen a lot of folks who grew up in this country, who are professionals, who are work just generally in our society, who are able to be able to pursue their careers, and really just be able to be a part of this country in a way where they're no longer having to hide. But I think that the anxiety of this program potentially being taken away by the federal government, being only upheld by courts, I think has caused quite a lot of anxiety. And I don't necessarily think that this is the end goal. And I think that we need to really fight for some type of stronger permanent protection for individuals who have been in this country for quite some time. And so I think, no, I don't think it needs to be eliminated, but I do think that we need to re-envision, what the fight is for. And so I think, I think that we've been, really, benefited as a state, I think, in having a lot of these young professionals who are able to stay here. Earlier this year, our organization with the New Mexico Dream Team, which is the state's largest youth organizing group, we were able to pass SB 137, which is a law that allows for professional licensing and occupational licensing for folks who don't have an immigration status. At least removing the regulatory barriers. And I think really the conversation is shifting and thinking about why is immigration so intertwined in all these areas that it doesn't need to be intertwined. And I think that, there have been moves by certain individuals, by the federal government and promoted by certain individuals to really try to make the life harder for immigrants in our country. But at the end of the day, I think that we just need to recognize that every one of us has something to contribute to our country, whether we're immigrants or not. And I think being able to really pursue what our calling is really would make this country a lot better. And I think just kind of thinking that division around immigration status, around occupations and professions is something that's not necessary. I think especially around driver's licenses. We had that conversation before with former Governor Susana Martinez, and I think we all just recognize that these are just things that we all need to be able to be our whole selves. And so I think that's really where I would like to think about how, at least in our state policies, how are we making sure that we're as welcoming an environment for everyone here, regardless of immigration status.
Now, I want to talk with you about social justice. There's a great conversation going on in the U.S. right now around that issue and how we address issues of racism in the United States and legacies of that and how it's played a role in history. We're having a conversation in New Mexico about how we honor historic figures in this state due to how they really were, and challenging that notion of history in our United States, of historic figures, I should say. How is your organization involved with the issue?
We are. I think obviously this has been something that's been impacting our communities for quite some time. And I think just under this administration, you could think about COVID-19 and how that is putting extra stress on our community. But we've seen, pushes against state-based violence against certain individuals for quite some time, particularly against the Black community. And so the way that we're involved is we're trying to think about this systemically, right? When you see calls for defund the police because there's too many resources being put into policing and not enough into our healthcare, our education, in other community programs, it's like mental health, then that's what causes some of this crime, right? The crimes that the police then are supposed to come in and fix. And I've seen and heard that some police departments are saying, look, we don't have the skills to deal with homelessness. or mental health. And so in Albuquerque here, there's a pilot program trying to get healthcare workers, medical professionals to go first to certain situations before the police is involved. And I think similarly, if you think about that in the immigration context, right? We have CBP, the Customs and Border Protection, you have ICE, who are being funded by millions of dollars that could be going to our community, right? And then the reasoning behind continuing to fund greater enforcement and greater Border Patrol presence is because there's sort of this fictionalized fear around violence in our communities. And I think it's important for us to think about why are we putting those resources into certain areas of the government instead of others. And I think that if you look at profits, right, private prisons, prison companies have been getting quite a lot of profits throughout the last few years. And so just kind of trying to see what the interest is. And I think really trying to highlight that and advocating for it. And I think that's really what Black Lives Matter is about. I think that's what all these movements are about, really just highlighting how a lot of these resources are being kept away from the communities that need them, particularly communities of color as well. And how do we re-envision a society where there's more equality around those resource uses?
Adriel Orozco is director for the New Mexico Immigrant Law Center. I want to thank you so much for joining us to talk about so many issues. I'm sorry, unfortunately, we are out of time, but thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Anthony, for the opportunity.
And we want to thank you for joining us for Fronteras, Changing America. I'm your host, Anthony Moreno. Remember, you can always send us your thoughts by email. You can email us at feedback@nmsu.edu. And we're on social media as well. You can like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter. We're on Instagram as well. You can follow us there and subscribe to the KRWG News YouTube channel. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.